Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another edition of Books and Looks. That's right, my weekly podcast where we talk about books, have author interviews, and something I'm looking at. And today we're doing something a little bit different. Yep, because a lot of you have texted me, commented to me, wanting to know more about what I am reading. What are you reading, Blaine? Tell us about that. Not just the authors, but what about you? Well, you could go to Instagram if you get my Instagram, and I do leave a couple recommendations a week on books I'm reading, but I thought tonight, or today, I should say, whenever you're listening to this, we could do something where I would talk to you about a book that I have read and highly recommend. And we won't have an author. It's just going to be me. But what we're going to do a little bit different here is that usually I can talk to the author about the book. They'll hit the high points, the selling points, etc. I don't have that, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to be reading portions of the book to you. Now, I'm not going into a 2-hour spiel here, folks, okay? But I am going to be doing that, going to be reading portions of the book to pique your interest, and you'll understand why I was so excited about this book. So, without further ado, why don't we get started right now with the book I'm talking about and me reading from some of the book, okay? And the book today we're going to be talking about is called 80 Days, subtitled Nellie Bly and Elizabeth Bisland's History-Making Race Around the World. It's by Matthew Goodman. It's around 400 pages in length. Again, the title, 80 Days, Nellie Bly and Elizabeth Bisland's History-Making Race Around the World. Now, do you recognize either of those names? Well, I never heard of Elizabeth Bisland. Nellie Bly I knew of. She was an investigative reporter in the 1800s, late 1800s, and so I was familiar with her. But I knew nothing about this little bit of history. I think that's what it is, a little bit of history that happened when these two ladies hooked up to race around the world. Now, where does this come from? Well, we go back, friends, to 1860s when Jules Verne, that's right, Jules Verne started writing and publishing his Voyage Extraordinaire, which are 54 tremendous books. One of those books, written in 1872, was called Around the World in 80 Days. Yeah. In which he set Phileas Fogg around the world to beat a designated time. He said, I can do it in 80 days. And, off he went to do that. It's a wonderful book. Many of his books are wonderful, but this is the one that had piqued people's interest, particularly because he went to all different countries, different modes of travel, etc., etc. And by 1888, Nellie Bly, who was an investigative reporter, thought she might want to try to equal or better that record. Well, that's pretty interesting. A young lady trying to better that record of 80 days. Well, let's learn a little bit, if we can, about these two women. Let's start first with Nellie Bly. Nellie Bly was a scrappy, hard-driving, ambitious reporter from the Pennsylvania coal country who sought out the most sensational news stories of the day, often going undercover to expose social injustice. She did a series on what was not at the time called insane asylums and the mistreatment of people there, and she got herself admitted to this place. It was really groundbreaking and changed a lot of the way people were treated in these facilities, thanks to her stories. On the other hand, genteel and elegant, Elizabeth Bisland had been born into an aristocratic Southern family. She preferred novels and poetry to newspapers and was widely referred to as the most beautiful woman in metropolitan journalism. They were both talented writers. They had both carved out successful careers in the highly competitive male-dominated world of big city newspapers. Yeah. And now there they are. They're going to race against time, against each other, unaided, alone, and ever aware that the slightest delay can mean the difference between victory and defeat. Yeah, what do you think of that? So that's a big setup, isn't it? Two women reporters back in the days in the 1880s. Wow, this is something that was not expected. Yeah, it was new. But she started out in a suburb of Pittsburgh. That's where she got her start, and then eventually moved over to New York to work for the New York World. When in 1888 she pitches to the editor of the New York World, how about if I go and try to beat Jules Verne's record? They said, nah, we don't need that. Don't need to do that. A year later, circulation is falling at the New York World, and they need something to, pick them up. They need something to somehow get readers 7 days a week. So the editor calls her in, and the same one who said to her a year earlier, we're not going to do it, said to her, you're on your own. You're off, not on your own. You're off to go around the world by yourself. And so there she goes. They decided to send her unchaperoned. And what she had was 2 to 3 days to get ready. Yep. It was a blur of activity, mapping out an itinerary, visiting ticketing offices, assembling a wardrobe, writing farewell letters to friends and family, packing and unpacking and packing again. But Bly had decided that she would take a single bag. Imagine that, friends. A single bag to go around the world in 80 days or less. It was a small leather gripsack into which she would pack everything from clothing to writing implements to toilet articles that she might require for her journey. Being able to carry her own bag would help prevent delays that might arise from the interference or incompetence of the porters and the custom officials. Now, what was she going to wear? Well, her traveling dress, she selected a snugly fitted 2-piece garment, a dark blue broadcloth trimmed with camel's hair, and for warmth she was taking a long black and white plaid Scotch ulster coat. Yeah, this is what she wore. And she wore a hat. It's called a gurley, and it's the type of hat that you often saw if you watch the Sherlock Holmes movies. Basil Rathbone wore that type of hat, the detective hat. This is what she wore. So this is all she had. This is all she took with her. And I think a dress in her bag. And off she went. She had 3 days' notice. Well, now that sounds interesting. But on the way to meet the boat, she was going to go across the east to west. She was going to leave from New York and go across the ocean. She was going to go to London and then do trains and ferries and boats or whatever to get around the world. Well, the day she was leaving, the New York World put a big article, a big story about her going to beat this. And the editor of a competing monthly magazine, which some of you may have heard of, called Cosmopolitan, yes, Cosmopolitan, decided, hey, why don't we do the same thing? We will get one of our female writers to go, and we're going to have her race Nellie Bly. But since Nellie Bly was going east around the world, we're going to send our girl west around the world. Mm-hmm. Not only that, they said, Nellie Bly has started. We got to get our person right away. And so they contact Elizabeth Bisland. Yeah, they contact her. And they say to her, we have this job for you to do. We'll take care of all the expenses. We'll take care of all the travel arrangements, et cetera, et cetera. And instead of going way Nellie Bly's going, we want you to go the opposite direction. Not only that, we want you to leave tonight. That's right, tonight. So with something like 8 hours notice, Elizabeth Bisland is on her way across America on train. Nellie Bly's going by boat across the Atlantic, and Elizabeth's going west to San Francisco. This is fantastic because when you look at the maps that show how these two women traveled, they're very similar. Okay, there are not many differences, just a few different differences, I should say, in the where they got the boat. One went from New York to London. Elizabeth Bisland went from Ireland to London, and a few little changes on the railroad. But basically, they were the same itineraries. It's amazing. But again, But there's a huge difference in the sense that Elizabeth Bisland always knew she was in a race, not just to beat the record of 80 days, the record, as written by a novelist, 80 days. She was out there to beat Nellie Bly. Nellie Bly had no idea that somebody was trying to get around the world faster than she was. She had no idea there was a competition. And the New York World was so cheap, they weren't telling her anything. At one point, they even basically told her, it costs too much for you to send lengthy dispatches. Just tell us where you are when you get to a spot. Here we are, London, November 15th. Okay, and that's all they wanted to know. So they weren't giving anything to her. She was giving minimal back to them. But again, the cosmopolitan people were following everything that was happening because the New York World was publishing everything in its newspaper. Everybody was in on this. Not only were they in on this, at one point in time, in order to increase Sunday circulation, they started a contest to guess when Nellie Bly was going to get back. All right, you had to guess the hour, the day, the almost down to the minute when she would return. And so this prompted many people to buy the Sunday paper, which, of course, increased the circulation because you could buy and enter as many times as you wanted. So not only did they have to hire more people to, correlate and collate all these guesses, but, they covered that easily by the cost of the people buying the newspaper, because you had to buy it. There was no way you could just walk in with a piece of paper. You had to have an official entry form. And so millions of people, millions of guesses were coming in as to when Nellie Bly was going to be arriving in New York. How many days, how many hours, how many minutes. It was obsession. People were obsessed about it all over the world. Oh, my. So, interestingly enough, she ends up going over to, in England, and from England, she goes over to France, okay? She goes to France, and when she gets there, she decides she's going to veer from her itinerary because she wants to meet Jules Verne. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we have a whole beautiful chapter of everything to do with her meeting of Jules Verne in his town of Amiens in France. And she met him on November 22nd, 1889. And Jules Verne, it says, looked like one of his own characters, a ship's captain perhaps, with wavy white hair swept back from his forehead and a thick gray beard, barrel-chested and still powerful-looking at the age of 61. He was of average height, standing about 5'5", and beside him his wife Honorine was several inches shorter and stout, wearing a sealskin jacket over a dark watered silk skirt, a small velvet bonnet on her head. And so she met Verne, and Jules Verne decided to take her back to the house. He didn't want to. He didn't see what could come of it from him by having Nellie Bly come to see him. But as his publicist said, this woman's trying to beat your record of 80 days, and she's come all this way. Don't you think you owe it to the woman to talk to her and see her? Well, of course, that's what he did. And it was a wonderful meeting. They got along famously. She couldn't believe Jules Verne because she said, a lot of your books are set in America. Have you ever been there? He said, I was at Niagara Falls one time, and that was it. The beauty about Jules Verne is this man wrote these Voyage Extraordinaire, 54 books, from his study in France. Yep, he didn't go do any of this stuff. He never went around the world. He never took these trains, but his house, his library, his study was filled with notes and papers and things that he got about everything in the world, maps and notes he would get from the scientific community over in London and in Paris. And he used all this to create these fantastic books. And if you haven't read them, folks, I got the whole schmeal of them. I got them all on Kindle, and they're very, very good. The thing is, they were technologically up to date for the times. People couldn't believe it. And when you read it now, you can't believe how good it is. There's wonderful writing, absolutely wonderful writing. And, I think that what he did from his home was out of this world. He even told her the way that he thought she should go. But she instead said, no, my line of travel is New York to London. Now, listen to this, folks. New York to London, then to Calais here in France, then Brindisi down in Italy, Port Said over in Egypt, Ismailia, Suez, Aden, Colombo, Penang, Singapore, Hong Kong, Yokohama, San Francisco, New York, all by herself, with nobody, with no one there to help her out. It was an exhausting trip. As a matter of fact, Elizabeth Bisland going the other way was exhausted by the time she got to California. She could barely move. Nellie Bly, exhausted by the time she got down to Amiens. She could barely move either. I mean, these women were pushing themselves because the modes of travel were so different and so harsh back then. Nowadays, if you want to go around the world, it might take you a couple days, 2-3 days of the plane, as a passenger. But think about that. 80 days, these two women. This is what this book is all about. This race that they had. Nellie Bly against time. Elizabeth Bisland against both time and Nellie Bly. And I got to be honest with you, as you go on, you will find that Nellie Bly was sticking to her original itinerary. Bisland, the Cosmopolitan magazine, wanted to make sure she won, so they were always making variations. Okay, here we go. Instead of going here, let's go there, do what? But the people they met was also, the people they met and associated with on the boats, on the trains, and the stops were symbolic of their lives. Nellie Bly always meeting with workers, always down at the docks, always at the train station. Elizabeth Bisland, the minute she got there, she had gotten connections with the highbrow, the elite of the city, and so she'd stay with them and do what she had to do up there and wait her time until the next leg began, the leg of the journey began. So it's amazing that the difference between the two, even though they're basically going the same way. By the way, Nellie Bly does find out about this eventually when she gets to Yokohama. When there's really nothing she can do because she has to go from Yokohama to San Francisco. That's when the first time she ever finds out that somebody is trying to do the exact same thing she did. And we never are quite sure if they ever crossed. Their paths may have crossed, but if they did, not consciously. But I'm telling you, I want to go back a minute, if I could, to the Jules Verne segment, because it's there's something about this which I found rather amusing, because, despite not wanting to have her there, he did decide to eventually give an interview to a magazine, or I guess maybe it's a magazine or a paper, the Pall Mall Gazette of London. So he was quoted as saying of her, "What took our hearts of both myself and Mrs. Verne was the complete modesty of this young person, and called her the prettiest young girl imaginable." That's very nice compliments. However, in private, though, he said, "My God, what a shame to see such a clever woman treated so badly by nature. Oh my, as thin as a match, neither bottom nor bosom. So she had no butt and no boobs." But of course, in the published way, she's the greatest thing. He did like her, and that's the thing. He did respect her, but he was so shocked that she would be able to try this thin as a match. And it's really something. And that's just it. This is just a few readings from this book that I hope pique your interest, because this is a book that came out, a while ago, maybe 7, 8, 9 years ago. I can't remember exactly when, but it's a book that'll be in your library. It'll be, obviously, it's on Kindle, it's on Amazon, It could be any number of places. And I think it's something you might want to really enjoy because we're talking about two women in the 1880s trying to get around the world and all that happened to them and the hardships that they had, the trip that they did, how they endured, and more importantly, what happened when they got back home. How were they treated? How were they received? And it's funny because when Nellie Bly got home, she was treated one way. When Elizabeth Bisland got home, she was treated something differently. Very interesting, and that's one of the fascinating parts about this book and about Nellie Bly and her career. Again, if you don't know much about Nellie Bly, she was a plucky woman, to put it mildly, and nothing wrong with Elizabeth Bisland, but just a different type of writer, different type of person. And anyway, the book is called 80 Days, Nellie Bly and Elizabeth Bisland's History-Making Race Around the World by Matthew Goodman. It is a wonderful piece of history, one that you never heard of before. Thank you, Matthew Goodman, for writing this book because it's really opened my eyes. And, we've talked a lot this fall season. We've had a lot of women on, if you've noticed, a lot of women's history, women's historical fiction writing. And I think this fits right in. I didn't start out to have the fall be mostly women writers, but I'm going to tell you what, they have done some wonderful work. And while this is not a woman writer, it's about two very, very good women who went around the world in a race to beat 80 days. Will they beat it? Who will win? You're going to have to read the book to find out. Anyway, that's it for 80 Days, Nellie Bly and Elizabeth Bisland's history-making race around the world. Now, you say to me, Blaine, you've talked the whole time here, so what are you looking at? Well, I'm not going to do officially a look, okay, because I have been talking the whole time. I hope you've borne with me, and I hope you appreciate what I'm doing here for all of you. I'm going to tell you what I'm looking at. Yeah, there's one little thing I'm looking at. I'm looking at next week. That's right, next week, because next week, one of my favorite writers is coming on. Her name is Nev, N-E-V, Nev March. And she has only written 3 books, but they are wonderful. They are called The Captain Jim and Lady Diana Mysteries. And this book we're going to be talking to her about is about her newest book. It's called The Spanish Diplomat's Secret. It is wonderful. Captain Jim and Lady Diana are from India, and they get together, and their journeys begin in the first book, which started basically in India. The second book, they're over in Boston and in Chicago. And this third book, they're on a boat going over towards England. And we're talking about a spectacular bit of writing by Nev March. She's a wonderful lady. I think you're going to really enjoy her book. If you have not read her books, please go out, read number 1 and number 2. Sets up everything tremendously. You wouldn't need it to read this book, but I'm going to tell you why. I think she's done a wonderful job, and that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at a very nice lady, a very good author, and a series that's set basically all over the world. India to Boston to Chicago, now going back to London. It's an interesting book, The Spanish Diplomat's Secret. Very, very fine. So anyway, that's all for me this week. I hope you've enjoyed it. We're going to come back periodically with episodes like this. And like I said, I hope you enjoy it. Let me know. So on behalf of viewsonbooks.com, on behalf of Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks saying, may all your leaves be pages in a book.